The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 6.
Several weeks prior to my first encounter with the giants, and Nuna's persistent shadowing, Dan and the White Flame had returned to Castle Vosse, home of the Order of the Sacred Fire. They intended to be the bringers of startling news, for they had discovered the growing orc horde was being led by the hill giants. Reese felt confident to report a clear coordination between the hill giants and the steady surge of hostile orcs, which had swept inexplicably across the vast borderlands, a mostly uninhabitable, barren landscape. These two races of chaotic evildoers seemed to be allied, sharing logistics and supply. As illogical as that seemed, Reese carried the only evidence he required: the severed giant hand wrapped in his pack. Fergus agreed to allow Reese to report for the group. Fergus was strangely reticent, his face locked in expressions of doubt, which was very unlike him. But when the White Flame finally returned to Castle Vosse, they received startling news that made their own story seem almost irrelevant. Keelan Thiel, the High Priest of the Order, cornerstone of the triad of power called the Triumvirate, had died that night in his sleep. Keelan Thiel was the spiritual center of the Order. All members and initiates of the Order were greatly saddened, but Fergos was stunned. He was a firm believer in life everlasting, on this plane and others. He believed this life was tied only temporarily to what Scripture called the continuation. The telling of truth gave continuity to the lives of mortal men. Armed with truth, mankind could then behold the grace of the immortals, however briefly, and witness the magnificent eternal existence of the Allfather. But despite this devout belief, Thiel's death, however peaceful and natural it seemed on the surface, was deeply painful for his most devoted learner. Thiel's sudden death was completely unexpected. The time and nature of this passing had remained unseen in anyone's prescience. Fergus was a priest that was notoriously gifted in that area, the power of foresight. How could I have missed this? He wondered, suffering silently. Fergus had studied with Thiel since he was a young boy. Thiel was renowned for his healing powers and his incredible acumen for diplomacy. He had authored many lasting treaties of unification between lords and kingdoms. His governance of Vosse attracted the best of all the races to it, which made it a hub for learning, culture, and commerce. It was Thiel's leadership and foundational presence that allowed Fergus to maintain his calm self-assurance throughout his adult life. His belief that good would always prevail versus evil. His confidence was built on the knowledge and power of the High Priest. Thiel was always there, offering the best guidance and most profound wisdom. Yet like a thief in the night, Moscal had dragged Thiel's gentle soul below, to his dark underworld realm, before Fergus could prey on it, or even say goodbye. In the days of mourning that followed, it was unclear who would succeed Thiel to the position of High Priest of the Order, now that the third master seat of the Triumvirate lay open. Bertal of Ukko seemed the logical choice, but he was notoriously uncertain of himself. Harmon of Tyr was the other ranking priest, and his underlings were already politicking for his ascension over Bertal. But Fergus could think nothing of replacement. How could Keelan Thiel be replaced? That was an absurdity. Fergus prayed, but could feel only emptiness. He remained beside the deathbed of his high priest for days, refusing food, abstaining of everything but prayer, hoping to gain insight into his master's sudden and unforeseen passing. Despite appearances, Fergus felt strongly Thiel's was an untimely death. Something evil had preceded his passing, or caused it. Fergus could finally see the source. Something dark had spawned within the Charmel River Valley. Fergus saw sneering red lips, chanting prayers of malevolence. Fergus then witnessed a nefarious blood sacrifice. Many innocents were slain in concert, which then caused his master's heart to stop beating. Fergus saw this and then he saw much more. Fergus saw massive piles of dead bodies that were being collected around a large stone ziggurat. This blood temple drew tortured souls to it, like moths to the flame. It had drawn Dantinuvial, and was now drawing in many others. But Fergus was struck deeply by how no one else seemed to notice. No one spoke of it, or even looked to the southwest, to the dangerous source of this growing evil. Fergus could not understand why it seemed to totally escape the Order's collective gaze. Thiel's body was laid to rest in the ancient tomb of Ascension, clad in immaculate religious dress and ornamentation. Treasure and artifacts surrounded him as his body was entombed amid the hum of deep spiritual sadness. The sarcophagus was lowered, and the thick stone cover closed with a rumble of heavy permanence. It was then Fergus felt true fear for the first time in his life. He was overcome suddenly by an unshakable coldness. No matter how many robes he wore, he could not warm his body. It was unchecked evil that he had discovered. It burned like a raging forest fire. Now, with the aid of changing winds, it turned its relentless eyes of consumption to the north and east, paving a path of destruction for the furious return of the giants. Fergus could now see it all, in one complete glance. The horde, the giants, and the growing power of outworldly evil. This assurance of truth planted a seed of fear deep into his abdomen. That fear swelled and churned in his stomach as it grew. The core of Fergus' benevolent spirit was reacting to the unchecked growth of a heinous dark power. This constant, debilitating nausea within Fergus' gut was caused by his limitless empathy for the innocent people of the Sharmal Valley. As Quell gathered ever more power from the depths of the underworld, the spirit of the demon Moscal grew closer to prominence in this world. Moscal was a powerful demon, a malignant demigod that dwelt in the abyss. Moscal appeared to Fergus in his visions like a black swirling tornado that lit fires as it tore across the lands callously, causing extreme suffering wherever it passed. It fragmented the hearts of men, turning them on one another. Fergus saw crying people, houses on fire, families destroyed, and men fighting each other for their survival. Then he saw glimpses of Thiel's face. Fergus tried to reach him. He attempted to contact his master spiritually, in the afterlife. Thiel's eyes were opened, and he offered Fergus a familiar, gentle smile, until a dark finger tapped his nose and the light came out of his eyes. The dark swirl of Moscal intensified within Fergus. He then vomited uncontrollably. Something very bad was happening. He gathered himself as best he could, and then shared his visions with the Order. 3 days after the funeral, a meeting was called by Silas and Galglados. Many of the Order were present. Absent was Ramthar of Promethea, who was leading the Green Flame to Cantum to help end the Raiders Coalition trade war. If there was something world-changing afoot, something that prompted the giants to come out of hiding and attack, the Order was certainly short-handed on some of its best members. And now the Order was deprived of its high priest and spiritual patriarch. Curiously absent for the funeral was the powerful wizard Ozymandias. Like many others, he had ventured to the Sharmal River Valley and not returned. His master Silas was troubled that he could not find or contact him anymore. Even Keelan Thiel had been unable to augur the wizard's location before his untimely death. Ozzy was considered lost, most likely dead. Though Silas considered if Ozzy was indeed dead, his remains would have been extremely easy to augur, unless they were displaced on another world. It remained a mystery. The Order was gathered in the circular hall that surrounded the sacred fire. The Order was founded over 2 centuries earlier and had maintained its ways of uniting different religions, cultures, and classes into a single entity that would defend truth and prosecute justice. Each of the colors of the flame, blue, green, red, gold and white, held a place beside the sacred fire in the middle. There was a dais extended above with 3 seats, one for each member of the ruling triumvirate. The high priest's seat was now empty. The high mage rose from his own seat to speak to the order.
Our time for sorrow is over. Our time to seek justice has once again been called upon. Most of you have seen the carnage for yourselves. Now once again, the world cries out for our aid. Be ready, be mindful, for war has come.
Gauntlets, the High Lord of the Order, rose next to speak. He was still quite young for that appointment. He received the elevation 2 years earlier, after the death of the great Lord Partham, the father of Ramthar. Most expected Ramthar to be named, but surprisingly, Gauntlets was made High Lord by Silas and Thiel, at only 34 years old. He was very young for such elevation, but his skill was beyond question. Dan, Thon, and both of Fergos' paladin shieldmen were certain they had learned from the best. Gauntlets spoke.
I will lead a mission to the 3 kingdoms and ensure the horde moves no further east.
Dan was excited to hear this. He was hopeful Gauntlets would request for him to join his mission. But before Dan could fully envision his return home, he learned he was not on his master's list.
I will take Rhys, Seshona, and Harmon. We will ascertain the threat, gather allies, and strike back.
Rhys was no longer the overseer of the White Flame. Fergos was now on his own, both spiritually and as leader of the White Flame. Seshona was an elven mage. Harmon, a prophet of Tyr, and the most likely candidate for High Priest of the Triumvirate. But he would not gain that title now, as no mention was made at that time for any replacement of Keelan Thiel. These 3 powerful members of the Order would follow behind Gauntlets to Torbana, under the banner of blue. Silas spoke again.
Fergos, you will lead the White back west. We believe there must be at least one makeshift stronghold somewhere to the southwest, where these giants are gathering. Find it and destroy it. If the giants are inspiring the orcs to courage, that must be stopped immediately, and with great force.
Silas continued on with urgent instructions for all the members of the Sacred Fire. They would all be separating from Vosse soon, all heading into what seemed like certain death. Dan was confused. He came to his friend and priest for wisdom.
Fergos, you're now to lead us west without Rhys. Are you ready?
He could see Fergos was startled by the question, and clearly not his normally optimistic and overly confident self.
Speak with your priest. Speak with Harmon. If you want to join them south, just beware of the Sharma. Beware of Alinor.
Fergos said quietly. His head was down.
I must pray now and prepare my men.
Dan reached out to hold Fergos' shoulder.
Hey, I'm with you, Fergos,
said Dan reassuringly. Dan smiled at his friend and leader, despite his own growing disappointment that he wouldn't be able to face Quell just yet. Fergos looked back into Dan's eyes with a strange blank stare, a visage of someone who had truly seen beyond death. His eyes appeared to no longer capture light, as the irises themselves were locked into a cloudy, lifeless abyss. Still, Dan looked back at Fergos with unbridled eagerness. His eyes were always excited to tempt death in battle, for that was his one sure path to the home of the immortals in that fabled hereafter where only the worthy go. Dan smiled at Fergos again reassuringly, but still could not get his desired response. The young cleric remained expressionless. Clearly, he was preoccupied and disturbed by Dan's efforts to cheer him. The White Flame's troubled leader stood up and headed quietly for his sanctum. Fergos was a notoriously gifted visionary, always offering inspiration and hope for all those around him. He had seen it, so in the end, everything would be okay. It was that kind of optimistic reassurance that he was always able to provide his comrades. But now, he was beset with a vision of the cloudy abyss. He said nothing and offered no reassurances. What he was now experiencing would require a miraculous amount of faith and courage to overcome. It is really only there, face to face with the abyss, that a man's courage can be tested. For without fear, what is bravery? That was Fergo's present conundrum, to find the courage necessary to overcome the bottomless depths of fear he was drowning in.
Dan, come here, young Tenuvio,
called Silas from the far length of the hall, as Dan watched his dear friend Fergus leave without another word. Silas' voice echoed throughout the sacred hall. Dan turned and looked over to the high mage who awaited him. Dan pointed at himself, surprised. Silas nodded and motioned for Dan to come with him.
Yes, my young warrior. I have something I want to show you.
Silas led Dan to his laboratory deep within the castle. Dan could not help but be overwhelmed by the endless displays, the scrolls, potions, and magic experiments. Only Khan and Theos had seen this laboratory before, and only they were smart enough to understand what was inside it. Silas led Dan to a table where lay the severed hand of the hill giant Rhys had brought back from the borderlands. It was in the middle of the table. A needle and tube had been stuck into each of the shriveled fingers, drawing out its remaining blood.
This is something I'd been hoping to design for quite a long time, but I think I've finally found success,
he said with a big smile.
There was enough of a blood sample here for me to use. I've fashioned this for you, young Dan.
Silas then revealed to Dan a fighter's girdle. It was a large leather belt with a platinum ring in the abdomen, emblazoned in gold with ancient runes. It also came with gold harnesses with many small but priceless jewels that had been seared into the golden belt. Tassels of what looked like grass reeds hung down below it. Each tassel ended in a bead that contained a small drop of the giant's blood. Master Silas handed his creation to Dan with a broad smile.
That's beautiful, Master Silas,
Dan said like a child who was given a toy he didn't want or understand.
I'm not much for adornment. I'm a simple fighter, you know.
That you are. And a brave and very skilled fighter, they tell me. Yes?
Silas laughed.
But please, humor me. Try it on.
Dan did as the High Mage asked, and fastened the belt to his waist, which also had a sturdy holder for his scabbard. Silas's eyes widened, and he looked at Dan quizzically.
So, how do you feel?
Dan turned to a large mirror nearby. He looked at his reflection and smiled anxiously.
A little silly, to be honest. Our Lord Galglados always teaches us to remain humble. Lord Rhys, to be inconspicuous. This is kind of, well, neither. Master Silas, you are too kind. I really couldn't wear something like this.
Silas laughed out loud again. He led Dan over to a large marble sculpture in the middle of the room. Silas was carving it in honor of his dearest friend, the deceased high priest, Keelan Thiel. It was 7 feet of solid marble and likely weighed a ton.
Dan, would you be so kind as to move this piece
Silas made a few steps towards the wall.
over here, to this side of the room for me?
Said Silas, pointing with an unqualifying tone. Dan was now feeling very awkward and confused about this unexpected encounter. He was still looking at himself in the mirror, trying to come up with the right words to get out of the situation. He was hardly paying attention to the High Mage.
Move the table? over there?
Dan asked, quite confused.
No, the marble statue.
Silas responded. Dan looked at it hesitantly. He then pointed towards it.
Master Silas, I don't even think Kiontan could budge that, let alone move it safely to the other side of the room. Should I get him and some others? Perhaps a lever or a sack truck.
Dan approached the statue and tapped on it gently. It was indeed solid marble.
Oblige me,
Silas commanded. In the wake of the high priest's death, everyone was acting strangely, it seemed. Dan did as he was told. He reached down to grab the marble block. As he tried to find the right way to grip it, he noticed both of his arms had swelled in size and definition. He did feel very powerful. He attempted to move the statue reluctantly, only to find it was much lighter than he had expected. He lifted it off the ground completely. Then he moved it slowly and placed it down. The wooden floor cracked beneath the stone as it made its impact with the floor.
Excellent. It works,
Silas exclaimed. Dan smiled and then reflected on the incredible feat of strength he had just performed.
Young Dan, whilst you wear this girdle, you shall have been bestowed the strength of a giant. Use this magic to your avail against them. Never go into battle without it,
Silas commanded. Over the next few days, the White Flame was geared up further for their mission west. Reggie had also been given a gift of magical strength in the form of gauntlets that gave him the strength of an ogre, as powerful as any man. He decided to test them out on Kiontan.
Brother Kiontan, I challenge you to an arm wrestle,
Reg said.
But we must wear our gauntlets. Huh. You can't be serious. Metal grip or no, you stand no chance to win against me, brother.
The hulking paladin smiled and got back to arranging his pack. He noticed Reg remained seated opposite the table from him, his right hand outstretched, inviting the contest. Dan and Thon approached, amused by the spectacle.
Have you been drinking wine again, my brother?
Kiontan asked jokingly. Reg waited patiently for him to join the challenge.
All right. With gauntlets, then, if you think that will help you.
He said, placing his own metal glove on his right hand. Reg was strong, but Kiontan was 6'5", and no man alive was known to be stronger. Their hands joined in friendly combat, as several others now gathered around the table to witness. Thon acted as the regulator and placed his hands atop their joined fists.
Go,
he said. At first, Kiontan was startled by the force of Reg's grip. Reg pushed hard, and Kiontan was shocked that Reg was actually pulling his arm towards the wooden table. Kiontan regrouped, pulling his arm back with all his might, restoring the original position. More interested spectators gathered as the contest continued much longer than anticipated. Reg and Kiontan were brothers in arms, both sworn to the quest and the protection of Fergos. But now they stared into each other's eyes with competitive angst, using all of their power against one another. The wooden table creaked under the massive pressure of the contest. Finally, as the crowd cheered on, Kiontan gained an advantage in leverage and finally managed to pin Reg's hand to the table.
Aha!
Called out Kiontan with the barbarian spirit of his ancestors. The small crowd cheered him. He was still the world's strongest man.
You see, my brother, even Khan's Eastern magic cannot overcome the true strength of the All-Father's chosen hand.
Kiontan blurted with unseemly arrogance. Despite losing, Reg was impressed by the gauntlet's power and got up to report their efficacy to the elvish wizard Seshona, who had bestowed them to him.
My turn,
said Dan. Kiontan looked up and snickered.
This is not a beauty contest we are having, Tunuvil.
Kiontan joked to the amused laughter of all present.
Has that little Easterner charmed you as well?
No gauntlets, just flesh,
Dan assured, smiling as he showed him his naked hands. The crowd regathered to see how long Dan could withstand Kiontan's mighty grip. Kiontan relented, laughing as he joined Dan's hand for the last match of the day. He breathed in deeply. Dan looked surprisingly confident to Thon, who once again regulated the match.
Ready? Go.
Kiontan smiled at Dan with a sense of a friendly farewell. But try as he might, Dan's arm could not be budged. Kiontan pulled harder, using all his strength, and yet Dan remained still, confident. Dan then pulled mighty Kiontan's arm to the table with relative ease. The small crowd cheered in surprise.
That's impossible. What trickery is this, Charmelman?
Cried Kiontan. Dan stood up, soaking in the adulation of his peers. In keeping with his growing legend, Dan had once again overcome insurmountable odds and performed the impossible for everyone to witness.
I must still have been tired from Reg. Where are you going?
Kiontan asked, demanding a rematch. Dan simply smiled and stepped away. He enjoyed rattling Kiontan's ego. So Dan kept the secret of his giant strength from Kiontan for a little while longer. Over the next few anxious weeks, the White Flame was drilled further on giant-killing tactics. Khan and Theos enlarged several initiates to giant size so the group of 7 could practice their tactics on them and rehearse as a team. Each of them practiced and researched intensely for their next encounter with the giants, maybe their last. The Order had provided all of the young members of the White Flame with new equipment, weapons, and instructions. Harmon, the High Priest of Tyr, gave Fergos a magic hammer and armor to use in combat. His new gambeson was emblazoned boldly with the symbols of the White Flame. Silas provided several scrolls, potions, and maps for Khan and Theos to use. As the biggest brains of the group, they were given the best information on where they might expect to find the Hill Giant stronghold. They worked closely and shared this information with the Ranger Thon, who would now lead the group as its sole pathfinder and designer of tactics. Then, as the cold fall rains began pouring down on the plains, they decided the time for training was over. It was time to go. As they made their way further west, into the shattered lands between Ebok and Teton, they encountered ever more displaced and desperate people. War, sickness, starvation, and misery seemed to intensify with each mile further west they traveled. The anguish and misery, the fire and death had passed through the Central Plain just as Fergos had envisioned. Fergos healed and fed many along the way. He was aware now that the path given to the White Flame was done so purposefully. The High Mage and High Lord wanted the young group to circumvent the Charmel River Valley, the source of the dark cloud that Fergus saw, and still feared silently. The White Flame's mission out west was secondary, for the High Lord Galglados and his best men would soon encounter that growing darkness head-on. Teton and the keep's surrounding villages had been hit especially hard. As Fergus witnessed ever greater acts of cruelty, his intense fear turned slowly to anger. The more misery he saw, the more judgment he wished to bring down upon the perpetrators. Fergus was not only dressed for battle, he had emerged from the pool of woe, above that permeation of the abyss that had locked his spirit in fear. Fergus was now ready. He was ready to lead the White Flame into this battle and many more to come. As he prayed at his mini-shrine in a makeshift tent, Thon entered.
We are being followed.
The ranger reported.
Followed? By whom?
Thon noticed Fergus' demeanor had changed. He did not expect an immediate response, so he was pleasantly surprised.
I'm not certain yet, but I have received reports from some of my advance scouts that a village to the south encountered an armed cadre of elves. Evidently, they offered aid and transport for some human refugees in the North Ostrom. I think there may be some woodlanders aware of our presence here. I'm quite certain they're the ones we've spotted on at least 2 separate occasions. They appear to be following our path. Woodland Elves? What do you think they could want? Will they interfere? Doubtful. They're definitely not friends to the hill giants or the orcs. I'm not sure why they've taken any interest in us, to be honest. We're now quite far from their ancestral homelands.
He paused as they both pondered. Then Thon got down to the matter at hand.
But we are close to our target. Real close.
Thon took out his map.
I'm seeing an intersection in attacks and return trails of captives and giant-class creatures, all heading in this vector.
Thon's map had an X, which marked the spot he suspected the hill giants may be gathering.
There could be an awful lot of them there, plus a large number of other hostiles. We should approach with caution.
Over the next few days, as they approached slowly on horseback, ever closer to the target they sought, they encountered ever greater devastation. Each small village they passed, down the King's Road, was broken. Some fires still burning among the embers of what were homes. The roads were littered with dismembered human bodies. As they passed these horrific scenes, each member of the flame reflected quite differently upon what he saw. Fergus saw the dashed hopes and dreams of each individual victim. Their dedicated work and daily toil were expended to build a life for their family, only to be destined for sudden ruin. He felt the deep pain of those who cried out for salvation, only to find none. He thought of the final prayers they had given to their beloved God, who, like his master, they were now united with. Fergos took some solace in that. His knights saw, with eyes flush with pity. They sensed a presence of evil which before seemed unimaginable. Even mighty Kiantan had a heart filled with sorrow for these poor souls he did not have the opportunity to save. Like their priest, both paladins were outraged and eager to exact justice on the perpetrators. Thon saw only evidence. He recreated the carnage in his mind, following the movements of the attackers and their human victims. He imagined it all happening by analyzing the many exhibits left behind. He followed their steps by way of their footprints, both large and small. He also observed what he perceived to be the approximate number of each raiding party. In this case, he counted 11 hill giants, or lesser ogres, at least 14 large wargs, several humanoid slave keepers, likely orcs or mixed-race humanoids, and at least 24 other giant-class hominoids. Trolls, mostly. Trolls were among the foulest of creatures. Their unmistakable stench still filled the air. The total destruction of this village told how the gathered horde brought heartless ferocity. Khan and Theo saw an increasing body count. The record-keeping aspect of this carnage seemed almost nonsensical to attempt to continue. But how much longer could this go on before even the most skeptical of lords would respond to Owen's call? They discussed the rapid escalation of attacks and the coordination of movement, so uncharacteristic of all of these creatures. Where was the intelligence behind all of this? There had to be someone or something else besides hill giants involved. Such coordination between simple-minded giants and hominoids was totally unprecedented. Dan saw one more shiny coin of vengeance to collect after the other. This currency of justice came in many forms. A torn limb of a child, its tiny innocent fingers likely ripped from the grasp of a loving parent. One more half-eaten body, a wasted life that was now his chosen duty to avenge. Each severed head that adorned a newly formed warning pike on the side of the road reminded Dan why he alone survived Alinor. He was granted another chance at this life by his God, specifically for this, to be right here, right now. No one else was better prepared or intimately motivated for such an undertaking as the slaughter of this giant steading. And Dan would soon have his opportunity.